Hey everyone, it's Andrew. Welcome back to my channel on Everything Books. Today we're going to be discussing the book The Shadow of the Hegemon by Orson Scott Card, which is this book right here. This is the second book in the Shadow series, or Shadow Quartet, which is this book series on the left here. For those of you that are not familiar with this book series, Orson Scott Card initially wrote the book Ender's Game, followed that up with three separate books, Xenocide, Children of the Mind, and Speaker for the Dead, which is in this book series. And then he followed up with the Shadows Quartet, which the first book in that series is Ender's Shadow, and then the second book is The Shadow of Hegemon, which I just finished reading today. And so what we'll do in this video is we're going to discuss this book in detail. I'll provide slight spoilers just because they're very pertinent to reviewing this book, but it really shouldn't ruin your book experience or book reading experience. And we'll just get started as far as discussing this book. So Shadow of the Hegemon, it follows up around the time period after Ender's Game or Ender's Shadow. If you've read Ender's Game, you're familiar with that. I'm not going to discuss it in detail. And then Ender's Shadow was a coinciding book that was written to discuss the time period of Ender's Game and the battle school from Bean's perspective. I previously discussed that book in detail about a year ago when I first read it, so you can check out that review for further detail. But in a quick summary, Ender's Shadow essentially followed Bean's story from when he grew up in Rotterdam on the streets and had him go to battle school, and ultimately just follows his whole experience from his perspective as compared to Ender's Game, which really focused on Ender's perspective. This book, The Shadow of the Hegemon, follows up immediately after that time period. So after Ender and his team have won the war, the Formics are dead, all of Ender and his kind of commanders have to go back to Earth and go back to kind of doing their regular life. Prior to this happening though, Ender, as well as his sister Valentine, because Ender's such a strong commander and he essentially won the war, he and everybody else decide to send him off into exile and not come back to Earth, because he's such a strong threat from a military perspective that he's either going to be killed or taken advantage of from a national perspective to win wars. And so from that standpoint, Ender is no longer in the equation. If you're interested in learning about the storyline for Ender and moving forwards after the war, that's where you want to read the Ender series. And that's all about his time period and Ender's storyline after the war. So it goes into the Children of the Mind, Xenocide, and Speaker for the Dead, and you can follow Ender's storyline completely separately after the Formic War through this book series. So that's what, if you want to go into that after Ender's Game, you can read directly into that and it won't have any pertinence to this. It alludes to certain aspects here just because it's pushed forward in time, but that's if you want to read Ender's story. Versus this one, the Shadow Quartet really focuses on Bean's perspective. So the initial book is Ender's Shadow. It talks about Bean's equivalent book of Ender's Game, and then it goes into The Shadow of Hegemon. So immediately after the war, as I was saying, Ender goes off, Valentine goes off, and there's Bean, who is essentially the strongest commander in the war, like the whole world at this point, because Ender is no longer in the picture, has to go back to Earth. And the rest of Ender's team has to go back to Earth as well. And so the book is built around this premise that because they're going back to Earth and they're these elite children, like commanders from a wartime perspective, they're the veterans and the most qualified, skilled military powers or intellectuals at this time. And the concern is when they go back to Earth to their respective countries, their countries are either going to take advantage of them to run their military powers, or other countries are going to come across and try to kill them so that they are not an advantage or used against them from a military standpoint. And so this whole book is really built around that premise. So it starts off with essentially everybody going back to Earth. Starts off with Petra going to Armenia, where her family was, where she hasn't been there since she's been 5 years old, and she's like hanging out on the streets with her dad, and her dad's reminiscing about things like stories that she was telling about like when she was 5 years old. But she's like, this is when I was 5 years old. I'm like 14 now. This isn't pertinent, and this isn't the life I want to live. I've like been a military veteran, and this isn't the life I want. So it starts off with that, but then she gets kidnapped. So it starts off first chapter like that. Meanwhile, Bean goes back to Greece. As you know from Ender's Shadow, if you read the book, because you have to read the book in order to read this book, his brother or twin is Nikolai, and he's with his parents and just hanging out on Greece, but somebody tries to kill Bean, but he survives the attack. And as this is going on, essentially you find out that Petra was kidnapped, as well as 9 of the other battle school elite that were part of Ender's army, and they're just kind of randomly kidnapped. And later on, this is a spoiler, I'm warning you, you find out that they're taken to Russia, and the person that kidnapped or organized the kidnapping is Achilles. And so if you recall from Ender's Shadow, Achilles was somebody that Bean grew up with on the streets of Rotterdam. He was initially the leader of his kind of gang that he was growing up with for survival. And Achilles ultimately kills one of Bean's best friend, Poke, in like cold blood. And then later on in Ender's Shadow, you find Achilles is like the main enemy character while he's in that battle school, and you find out that Achilles is 1, a serial killer, but 2, a psychopath, and 3, he just murders anybody that kind of sees him in a vulnerable position. So in Ender's Shadow, Bean essentially captures Achilles, and Achilles is sent off to a mental institution, and you think he's never going to come about again, but he becomes the main antagonist in this storyline because he's freed from the mental institution. He kidnaps the battle school elite, and then the whole rest of the story revolves around Bean attempting to save Petra and the other battle school elite, and prevent a worldwide war from breaking out, because Achilles is trying to kind of take advantage of his knowledge from a battle school and kind of military perspective to become the ultimate ruler of the world. So Bean goes about doing this, and along the way, because this is pertinent, he does reach out to Ender's and Valentine's brother, Peter Wiggin, who from the prior books you know is the one responsible for Locke. And Locke was like Locke is this email character that is this political kind of person that influences all these geopolitical things, and Peter Wiggin was behind it the whole time, and Locke was responsible for kind of sending Ender into exile to prevent wars from breaking out from Ender coming home, because he foresaw that. And you find out that kind of Peter Wiggin's just this kind of college student that has Locke, and there's this whole dynamic and background between Bean reaching out to Peter to try to kind of take advantage of his political power to, one, save Petra and the other students, but preventing them from kind of having a whole worldwide war. So that's really the gist of this entire story for The Shadow of the Hegemon. In general, I liked the book. I read it very quickly. It took me about a day. It's about 400 pages or so. I think it was like 440 pages. I found it as a nice transition from the Ender's Game and Ender's Shadow stories, because this is realistically what would kind of happen if you trained a bunch of children to be like the world's elite commanders for your military force. And because the world and the human race is no longer threatened by the Formics, this is what would happen, because the international fleet doesn't need these children. They would send them home, and because they're the veterans from the prior war and the only ones that are really trained for these types of wars, these nations are going to try to take advantage of them. So it was a nice transition from that standpoint. And I like the fact that it wasn't really science fiction-y compared to the other books. It was kind of realistic. It just really focused on the character development, like the connections between the characters, and laying the background of what would happen in this situation. Some of it's a little bit out there as far as like the power and like how much power Achilles has in certain situations, and how Peter Wiggin ultimately comes to power as being Hegemon. But the storyline is kind of, you follow it, it is pretty action-packed, and I thought it was a worthwhile read compared to the other books. And so that's really all I have about this book. I highly recommend it from if you're following this series as far as the Shadow series. I'll say that in general, as I discussed, you have to read Ender's Game and you have to read Ender's Shadow before reading this. If you haven't read those books, you can't read this. If you read it, because if you try to pick this up, it's just going to ruin the plot for other books. No matter what, you do have to read Ender's Shadow before this, because this book alludes to kind of Bean's background in detail, and you won't know about Achilles and you won't know about the rest of the storyline. So you do have to read Ender's Shadow before this, but you definitely don't have to go down the road of reading the rest of the Ender series before reading this. So if you want to read Ender's Game and then come to the Shadow, like the Ender's Shadow as well as this, you can do that. You don't necessarily have to read the rest of Ender's series in order to get the full value of this. And this book will not be spoiled, or you won't spoil these books by reading this earlier, because in these books they kind of allude to this background in the storyline. It's just the sequential order of kind of how the books work is these were published first, followed by the Shadow series. So that's all I have for this book. The next one, as far as order in this, is Shadow Puppets, which is this one right here. I do not know anything about this book, but I'll definitely be reading it soon, and I'll definitely do a book review and discussion of this as I read it. So if you're interested in following up with that, definitely click the like and subscribe below. And thanks for watching. If you have questions, comments, post them below. And thanks for watching, and please subscribe to my channel.